Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron, and in today's 22nd episode of our featured weekly build discussion series, we're taking a look at Winkeeper's split personality Juggernaut. Oftentimes, Juggernauts are perceived or caricaturized as simply characters that wander around and are too stupid to know any better. They walk around with low levels of intelligence, barely able to communicate a concise sentence, let alone a paragraph, and they do their best to simply smash anything that's in their way. Well, how about this? Why don't you try on an intelligence-based Juggernaut that can take down, yes, Tier 16 Kosis, Tier 16 Forge of the Phoenix maps, and stack as much energy shield as you could want to stack with an intelligence-based build. If that is the sort of intriguing setup that has you percolating for a build, then this particular HOWA Juggernaut is right up your alley. Stay tuned as we discuss the path of building, the skill gems, and more on today's 22nd episode of our featured build discussion. For those of you who are new to the channel, you can like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about more discussions just like this one. Not only is Winkeeper a great build guide creator, he's also a connoisseur of memes like myself, and that's something that I can appreciate. Anyway, moving on from the memes, let's take a look at the pros and cons as described by Winkeeper. First off, the pros of this particular split personality Juggernaut are that it's got an average of about 13 to 15k energy shield. If you like to have a large health pool that is simply sitting in one spot, oftentimes players like to have large health pools, but they rely on MOM in order to extend their life pool even larger. If you just want to have one single line of stats that shows you exactly how much HP you've got and how much damage you can tank, then this is going to be a build for you. If you're looking for a build that can take on all content, whether that's bossing or map clearing, whether that's doing juiced up tier 16 delirium maps, or if that's simply target farming a particular boss, this is a build for you. If you're sick of dying and you want to keep your XP rather than give it back to Chris Wilson from dying every time and losing 10% of your XP, then this is a build for you. It's also got some fast mapping options, and one of the things that I love about Winkeeper's build guide is that he gives us a couple of different ways to play this build, whether or not we want to play it with a more speed clear focus or a more boss killing focus. Also, this build scales greatly with in-game intelligence gear. In other words, if you're looking for a build that you can sink a whole bunch of currency into, maybe wrap up your league with, or even use as a massive project for all of your currency that's sitting over in standard, this is a great build to scale with investment. If you like having relatively few buttons to manage, then this is a build for you. And lastly, this build can do reflect with 3 or 4 links. But that doesn't mean that this build is right for you because it's good at everything. It's not. There are a couple of cons to this particular build. For instance, this is not a great league starter build. There are some uniques that are going to be required in slot, making it also pretty tough for solo self-found. And of course, getting top tier amounts of energy shield in any kind of league start scenario is going to be dependent on the luck of your drops and how much you're interacting with the trade mechanics of a particular league. So this really isn't a great league starter. Also, it gets more and more expensive the more and more you try to min-max. Generally, there are diminishing returns on any build the further you get into capping your stats on a build, and this particular build is no exception to that. So if you're looking for something cheap, this is not it. Lastly, while there are some setups that you can play this build on that make it faster than its traditional bossing setup, this is by no means going to compete with any of your fastest style of move speed characters. So what makes Winkeeper's HOWA Juggernaut any different from anything else? Well, as in the title, it's a split personality based Juggernaut. So, according to Winkeeper, as soon as he heard about the split personalities coming out, especially the ones that give you intelligence and maximum energy shield, he began crafting a tree. This is ultimately the tree that he ends up with, where you go CI, Elemental Overload, Ghost Reaver, Point Blank, and Zealot's Oath. And of course, you're looking to pick up as many Outer Rim nodes as possible, and you want those nodes to be relatively far away from your starting position, so that way you are scaling up your split personality returns that you're getting for every node that is from your starting location. In other words, the new cluster jewels that everyone is using and abusing inside Delirium League are indeed usable on more builds than just on Herald stacking, Aura stacking Guardians. You can use them on a whole bunch of different builds, including a HOWA Intelligence stacking Juggernaut. Two particular cluster nodes that are important for this particular build are going to be obviously the split personality, which here Winkeeper shows us in the spot that he slots it in. It gives 88 to intelligence and 88 to maximum energy shield. That is a massive amount of flat stats for any build, let alone a build that then is going to be scaling up those percentages off of those flat values. That is simply massive for stat stackers. Beyond using split personality, you're also going to want to use supercharge, which grants you lightning damage with non-critical strikes is lucky. This will boost up your damage considerably, as the vast majority of our damage, of course, is going to be lightning. And because lightning has got such a wide range that it can roll, the more we can make our damage lucky, the higher average damage we're going to have. For your Ascendancy, we are of course playing a Juggernaut, and Winkeeper recommends that you start by grabbing Unstoppable. This node gives you 10% increased movement speed, which helps as you are progressing through the 10x story campaign. Also, you cannot be stunned. That is a fantastic ability to have because it's going to prevent you from being slowed down. Also, your action speed cannot be modified to below the base value, which means all of those temporal change curses that are being placed on you while you are leveling or while you are mapping, those will reduce your action speed, but only to a certain point. The same is true for your movement speed, as that can only be reduced to its base value. In other words, stuff can slow you down, but it can only slow you down to your base value, and nothing can stun you as soon as you grab Unstoppable. I guess that's why they call it Unstoppable. For your second labyrinth, you can choose to either go with Undeniable or with Unflinching. I generally go with Unflinching when I'm playing Juggernauts, especially in hardcore, because it gives you a 30% chance to gain an endurance charge when you are hit, and then a 25% chance that if you would gain an endurance charge, you instead gain up to your maximum amount of endurance charges. On top of that, you gain 1 endurance charge every second if you've been hit recently, and you've got +1 to your maximum amount of endurance charges, meaning without any other investment, as soon as you get Unflinching, you've got 4 endurance charges and some healthy, happy, consistent ways to generate those charges. Your other option as a second choice or third choice is Undeniable, which gives you 1,000 to flat accuracy, 1% increased attack speed per 200 accuracy, and then 30% increased accuracy rating if you've dealt a critical strike in the past 8 seconds, and 30% increased damage if you've dealt a critical strike in the past 8 seconds. Then we gain accuracy rating equal to our strength. If you'll note here on the endgame version of this particular build, Winkeeper has got about 436 strength, so that's going directly into our accuracy, which is quite nice. It's a nice flat bonus. The reason why Undeniable's last 8 seconds matter for accuracy and for damage are because, of course, we are using Elemental Overload. This gives us 40% more elemental damage if you've dealt a crit in the past 8 seconds. So there's a whole bunch of different ongoing effects that are going to apply to our damage and to our character as soon as we've crit over the last 8 seconds or so. And with our crit rate on this particular build at the spot where it's at with its attack rate, we're going to be critting at least every 8 seconds, which is great because it means all of those consistent perks are going to be just that, consistent, because their uptime is going to be nearly permanent as long as we're attacking something. For your Uber Lab Ascendancy, Winkeeper recommends that you take Unbreakable, which gives you flat 2% regeneration of your health per second. Also a flat 5% reduced damage taken. Notice that that is a flat amount of just damage taken across the board. Chaos damage, elemental damage, physical damage. It's just reduced damage taken. It's fantastic. Also, armor received from your body, armor is doubled, which is good for a flat amount of armor, which we don't necessarily have a ton of armor on the build naturally because we're looking for intelligence and energy shield gear. So any little amount of boost to armor that we can have is a good thing, whether or not we're leveling or mapping. And then lastly, 1.5% of total physical damage prevented from hits in the past 10 seconds is regenerated as life per second. So as you're taking damage, your regen is actually going up. Besides for Elemental Overload, you will notice that there are 3 major key components to making this build tick. Of course, it is getting as far away from your starting location with your split personality as possible. That's why this particular node that is in between the Marauder and the Duelist tree is so dang important, because this is as far away from our starting node as we can stretch on this particular build. And in addition to that, you notice that we are taking Outer Rim Cluster Jewel spots along the Witch and Shadow tree, and then along the Shadow and Ranger tree, and then lastly between the Ranger and Duelist tree. Those are the 3 spots where we want to be stacking our cluster jewels for maximum efficiency. Of course, this is a HOWA Juggernaut, which means we are going to be using the Hand of Wisdom and Action Imperial Claw. We're going to be dual wielding these as we can, and these give us 1 to 10 lightning damage to attacks with this weapon per 10 intelligence. This is one of the reasons why we want to stack as much intelligence as possible, because not only is it giving us our defensive layer for our health pool of energy shield, but it's also scaling our flat lightning damage. In your body armor, you want to use the Incandescent Heart. This is where we're going to be getting a whole bunch of armor, a whole bunch of energy shield. And of course, don't forget that that body armor is going to scale up even further because of our Ascendancy. And then on top of that, we're going to get 25% of elemental damage from hits taken as chaos damage, which, remember, we're a CI build, which means we don't care about chaos damage at all. That means 25% of elemental damage taken from hits is simply going bye-bye. We don't care about it at all. Then we're going to gain 19% of elemental damage as extra chaos damage that we are dealing. And lastly, it's a nice quality of life because it saves you a passive point. Light Radius is going to be based on your energy shield instead of life. Any CI character is going to go out of their way to make sure that that happens. Otherwise, you're going to be left making a couple of choices on your passive tree. You'll either need to go out of your way and grab Arcane Vision, which is a passive point, and in this particular build, passive points equal massive amounts of power, and we would much rather be spending those passive points on that massive amount of power rather than on something like Quality of Life about Life Radius. Our main skill that we're using for damage is going to be Molten Strike, and so we're going to want to socket Wildfire into our build. This is going to give us 2 additional projectiles on every single Molten Strike that we hit with an enemy. Each and every one of those projectiles is going to be extra damage and extra chance to crit, extra chance to activate all of those different perks from our Ascendancy, as well as through Elemental Overload. You can just see from looking at this path of building, which, by the way, this is down below in the video description if you'd like to take a look for yourself. All of the split personalities on this particular build are massive stat boosts across the board. We are trying to stack as many split personalities as we can into this build. So if this looks like a build that is using a whole bunch of jewel sockets and is trying to stack as much intelligence and as much energy shield as possible, that's because that's what this build is exactly trying to do. So if you're nervous about using split personality, or maybe you don't have access to them, then this probably would be a build to stay away from. Conversely, if you can get your hands on these split personalities while they're still relatively cheap, either not being legacy themselves or not being nerfed, now is the time to get your hands on them. Your main 6-link damage source is going to be a Molten Strike using Elemental Focus, damage on full life, awakened elemental damage with attacks. Of course, all of this stuff could be awakened if you can afford it, or you can just use elemental damage with attacks, multi-strike, and then Ancestral Call. One of the reasons why Ancestral Call is so important, I've actually helped out several different players over the last couple of weeks, and I've noticed that they're playing builds that don't take advantage of Ancestral Call. What Ancestral Call essentially does is it creates more abilities for you to actually be proccing on your target. So while you may socket Ancestral Call in the game or in a path of building and it doesn't necessarily boost up your DPS numbers by a whole bunch, believe me, the amount of quality of life that is there with damage from essentially copies of yourself hitting a particular target is a massive increase in damage. Each of the Ancestral Call guys that get summoned when you attack with Molten Strike create their own amount of Molten Strike projectiles that they will fire off. And those number of projectiles are actually based off of your number of projectiles. So in other words, if you're using things like Dying Sun or you're using something like Wildfire, that makes it so that way there's more projectiles going with your Molten Strike. Each of those single explosions fires more projectiles, and each of the single explosions that your Ancestral Calls are going to summon and fire off are also going to create even more balls. In other words, if you like doing damage with balls, this is a big balls build for you. One little note here on the auras, you'll notice, of course, we're using Discipline and Blood and Sand, but you'll also notice that Winkeeper recommends we use Summon Skitterbots. Skitterbots are incredibly helpful on any build that can benefit from enemies being shocked. This is a status effect that means that enemies are going to take increased damage. So when you've got 2 little Skitterbots running around making sure that everything that is near them is going to get shocked, it means your damage across the board goes up. It is a massive damage boost. And the quality of life of making anything near your Skitterbot be chilled as well is also a pretty nice defensive boost as well. In addition to Supercharge, a few other notables that you should be looking for on your cluster jewels, on your rare cluster jewels, should be Storm Drinker, which allows your damage to penetrate a percentage of lightning resistance. It also means that some of your lightning damage is leached to you back as energy shield. Then Doriani's Lesson gives you increased elemental damage and a percentage of your elemental damage leached as life. And then lastly, Prismatic Heart, which gives you a flat amount of increased elemental damage and percent increases to all elemental resistances. Now, we've been discussing for a few minutes here about how this is a HOWA Molten Strike build, but Winkeeper recognizes that not everybody likes Molten Strike. So if you'd like to play this build as another skill gem, then have no worries, because Winkeeper has already done some of the theory crafting for you on swapping some gems out. So if you would like to play around with this particular build, maybe play some jazz, some PoE jazz of your own, and maybe take this build as an imprint or as an outline, and then scale up your own way, playing with your own preferred skill of choice, then Winkeeper has got some thoughts on a couple of different main skills that you could consider as options for your main 6-link damage source. Not only does Winkeeper give great tips and great guides on his own, but he also recognizes that there are other players out there who are innovating, and he builds it back into his original guide himself. So Shakani originally made a suggestion to use Ball Lightning with Chain. This creates an interaction that hits an incredible amount at an incredibly high rate. So if you're looking for any way that you can increase the amount of energy shield that you are getting back based on hits, then you can use GMP, Ball Lightning, and Chain to make sure that you are getting back as much energy shield as is shown in this particular smart setup, thanks to Shakoni. Well, thanks so much for joining us today for our 22nd episode of our weekly build discussion series, as we take a look at different guides and different builds that different creators in the community contribute and offer up. Thanks so much to Winkeeper for allowing us to feature this particular build for our discussion this week. If you've got suggestions, maybe you've played a HOWA Juggernaut in the past, maybe you've played Molten Strike and have got your own tips or your own tricks, feel free to leave us a comment down below. And of course, if you've got any questions about the particular build, I can personally vouch that Winkeeper got back to me incredibly quickly when I reached out to him with a couple of my own questions. So this is a wonderful, wonderful build guide creator that you should absolutely feel free to drop a comment on his forum guide. And of course, that link is down below in the video description. Thanks once again so much for watching, everyone. I look forward to reading your comments down below. And I hope that today is the day, as you are jumping around however you want to, a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.